Long before refrigerators and central heating, before the wonders of electric blankets or microwaved cocoa, it was just you, your family, a wooden wagon, and a cold that had ambition. A prairie snowstorm didn't just drop by for a quick hello. It moved in, ate all the dried beans, and stayed long enough to teach your cows algebra. But amid the gusting winds and snow thick enough to erase horizons, families still somehow snuggled together and made it through. Picture it. America, mid-1800s. Somewhere between Missouri and whatever dreams lay west of Missouri. Wagons creaked under canvas stretched tighter than Aunt Margaret's pie crust. Wheels groaned like old men in church pews. Families setting out on the Oregon Trail and other westbound hopes knew they'd face unimaginable cold. But they didn't truly grasp what unimaginable meant until they were trying to light a fire in winds that blew sideways at 40 miles an hour. Inside the wagon, covered wagons were, structurally speaking, one step above a glorified slicing board on wheels. No insulation, no glass windows, just a curved canvas arch meant to keep rain out and humans vaguely inside. But when the snowstorms came, blizzards thick enough to erase all sound, but the slightly menacing huff of the wind, there was only one rule. Everyone inside, and pile on top of each other like human lasagna. Children slept beneath buffalo robes, between their parents and siblings, usually in a tangle of elbows and half-dreamed arguments. Buffalo robes, by the way, were not a designer trend, but rather enormous, hairy, heavy blankets made from, you guessed it, buffalo. They were coarse, smelled like sadness, and weighed more than a fat raccoon in winter, but they kept heat in and frostbite out, mostly. Now you might be wondering about fires. Surely, you might murmur, no one lit fires inside a wooden wagon, right? Oh, but they tried. Small portable stoves called sheet iron stoves could be rigged inside the wagon or just outside under a flap and fed with buffalo chips, dried manure, essentially the prairie's most humble yet dependable source of warmth. Imagine waking up not to birdsong, but to the crisp sizzle of a burning patty of last week's cow output. Romantic. Meals on blizzard nights were whatever could be boiled by breath and desperation. Think hardtack softened in water, if the water wasn't frozen solid. Bits of jerky, perhaps a few remnants of beans, often tragically unsoaked due to the minor inconvenience of everything being frozen. Little ones would be handed tin mugs of something vaguely warm, dubbing it soup in the loosest possible sense. It was less Julia Child and more please don't die chowder. Despite the struggle, families did what humans always do when chaos howls at the edge of the cloth wall. They found ways to comfort each other. Mothers told half-remembered tales by lamplight. Fathers secretly cursed the wind while trying to whittle spoons out of despair. Somewhere beneath 6 layers of blankets and 3 startled chickens, a child would whisper a question like, "Will Grandpa's toes come back?" And someone would chuckle softly and invent a story about how toes sometimes take vacations during winter, but always return when it's safe. Entertainment was low-tech but high warmth. Singing, a lot of it. You haven't lived until you've hummed "Skip to My Lou" for 11 hours straight, while your sibling uses your shoulder as a pillow and your knee as a nose wipe. There were riddles, recitations of the alphabet backwards, and once, famously, an improvised puppet show performed by a woman named Elsie using nothing but mittens and aggressive optimism. And still, amid the swaying shadows of lanterns, the long breaths of the oxen outside, and the occasional snowflake that had the audacity to sneak inside and land on someone's nose, there was something deeply tender about these nights. Blizzards, forced families into smallness, not just by square footage, but into a closeness only hardship allows. Silence became a lullaby, and even the fiercest wind eventually tired itself out like a cranky uncle after dinner. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, pull the covers up a little higher and picture the glow of the lantern getting dimmer, the creaking of the wagon quieting, and the prairie wind curling round the canvas like a cat beside your feet. By the time the first snowflake whispered down onto the wooden bonnet of a covered wagon, the average pioneer family knew what was coming. Several weeks of being cold, annoyed with one another, and somewhat regretful that they'd ever left Cincinnati. Wagon travel, especially in the winter months, was kind of like camping. If your tent had wooden wheels and constantly threatened to blow away with your dignity still inside it. But before that blizzard swept in with its dramatic flare, icy wind howling like a gossiping neighbor and snow piling up like unpaid debts, families would do their best to prepare the little wooden box they called home. And I mean little. The inside of a covered wagon was roughly the size of a modern-day minivan. If that minivan only allowed for vertical sitting, smelled faintly of ox, and came with absolutely zero cup holders. At most, it was around 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. That's 4 feet wide, shared among Ma, Pa, 3 kids named Eustace, Lurleen, and something unnecessarily biblical like Obadiah, plus a grain sack full of pickled turnips and a musket. Now, when the storm clouds darkened and the wind nipped at the wagon's canvas like an impatient mother-in-law, the family would hunker down inside. First order of business, insulation. Since fiberglass hadn't exactly made its debut yet, and duct tape was still a distant fantasy, pioneers did what they could with what they had. That meant stuffing cracks with whatever wasn't currently being worn. Spare socks, woolen shawls, quilt corners, even pages torn from that one copy of Godey's Lady's Book someone had been hoarding since Missouri. The rule of thumb was simple. If it could block the wind, it became home decor. Beds were less sleeping surfaces and more strategic pile management. At night, blankets became gold, thick quilts, buffalo hides if you were lucky, or at least if your uncle had once done a spirited bit of prairie poaching before he got dysentery. Families slept like sardines in a can, layered and interlocked, not for affection necessarily, but pure thermodynamic necessity. Young children were tucked deepest inside the bundle, while Pa often claimed the perimeter, stoically blocking the breeze with his scratchy wool overcoat and a series of muffled grumbles. If you're picturing candlelight gently warming this rustic scene, I regret to inform you. Open flames inside a wagon covered entirely in oiled canvas and dreams was not a brilliant idea. Instead, warmth came from body heat and thick layers of clothing. Pioneer fashion was less about elegance and more about wearing every single item you owned stacked on top of itself. Imagine putting on 3 wool dresses, then a cloak, then another dress, and then crawling into bed next to your entire family, while trying not to think about the last time any of you had bathed. Dinner during these blizzard nights was what one might kindly call creative. A family might heat hardtack, which, if you've never had the pleasure, tastes like an ambitious cookie made entirely of drywall, over a hot brick previously warmed in the wagon's minimal cooking fire. Swiftly extinguished and monitored with more paranoia than a 19th century beard contest. Dried apples were common, beans if you had them, pickled vegetables when desperate, or molasses drizzled on snow, which was less meal and more mental diversion. Imagine SpaghettiOs without the O's, the spaghetti, or frankly, any joy. And yet, something about those nights, coiled up under quilts in the dim nesting space of the wagon, told its own quiet story. In the dead stillness of a snow-swept prairie evening, wind brushing against the canvas like an oversized cat with frostbite, families told stories, fables, scripture, songs that wandered off tune halfway through the second verse. Children fell asleep to the lilt of a parent's voice, a voice made softer by necessity, keeping calm and warmth alive with nothing but syllables and stubbornness. And snow kept falling, quietly, softly, indifferently, laying its heavy hush across the land, burying trail ruts and toppled fence posts under smooth white forgetfulness. Outside, the world was frozen still. Inside, a crock covered in linen held perhaps the only hot object in the wagon, a stew cooling slowly. The scent of boiled beans and salt pork lingered. Eventually, even Ma, always the last to settle her thoughts, tucked her feet under Pa's coat, sighed once, and let her eyelids win the argument. And so passed another long, huddled night across the great American nothing. Yet morning did still come, pale and sharp and promising all sorts of new challenges. But before the day could begin, something had to be done about those boots, left near the door and now frozen into cheerful foot-shaped hunks. It was, of course, the children's job to re-warm them. That was wagon life. And speaking of the boots, one of them had a hole in it, a rather problematic one. Repairing it would be an adventure of its own, a chilly, needle-pricking, and mildly chaotic adventure. As the wind began to howl like an offended banshee outside the canvas of the covered wagon, the Clark family huddled together with the determined coziness of people who had absolutely no idea how cold things could still get. The temperature was dropping faster than their morale, and more snow had fallen in the last 5 hours than Aunt Maud's cherry cobbler did in the kitchen last July. An impressive feat if you knew Aunt Maud. Inside their wagon, built sturdier than a drunkard's apology, but only slightly more watertight, the Clarks had entered what historians fondly call survival mode, a refined ritual of stuffing people, animals, cooking pots, and occasionally a confused chicken into a space roughly the size of a small pantry. Covered wagons were not known for their floor space, or ceilings, or insulation, or comfort of any conceivable kind. Still, the pioneers were nothing if not resourceful. Blankets, woven by hand back when everyone still thought crossing Missouri was a good idea, were stacked not only on beds, but hung on the wagon walls like makeshift insulation. Except these were not the Pinterest-pleasing wool throws of today. No, these were blankets that scratched your skin just from thinking about them. But come blizzard night, even a blanket made of angry cats would have been welcome. Bedtime logistics inside a wagon were an exercise in what we might now call extreme family proximity engineering. The parents often slept at one end, the children packed in wherever they could be layered like biscuits in a Dutch oven. And somewhere in the stifled darkness, a candle might be flickering, a small, illegal flame of hope prohibited strictly by everyone who had ever warned, "Don't burn the wagon down." Now, let us take a moment to appreciate the sheer absurdity and mastery of sleep arrangements in the covered wagon. There were no air mattresses, no memory foam, unless you count the memory of how sore you'd be in the morning. The floor was sometimes layered with feather ticks, but more often, it was just a wooden plank and your own optimism. Despite the crammed quarters, decorum somehow remained. Families rotated sleeping positions. Heads to the left one night, feet the next. This wasn't just for fairness. It was also to prevent full-blown warfare over who got cozy with the dog and who got cozy with the leaky corner of the wagon. Speaking of dogs, the family pet, a wiry little mutt named Buttons, was arguably the warmest asset inside the Clark wagon. Buttons had mastered the art of burrowing deep into piles of limbs and blankets like a heat-seeking sock with a tail, finding the warmest human and gluing herself there for the night. Her loyalty was mostly temperature-based, and no one faulted her for it. Aromatics played a role. With no ventilation beyond a flap that might let in an Arctic gust strong enough to rearrange your hairline, every smell was personal. Leftover stew, smelled it. Damp wool, living in it. Uncle Horace's feet, still regretting it. But the late-night air carried a surprisingly nostalgic scent too. Wood smoke wafting through wagon seams, a hint of pine from the surrounding forest, and the soft, buttery smell of cornbread reheated on a tin stove. Ah yes, the stove. Only the luckiest of wagons had a small cast-iron stove inside, and only the bravest operated it through a winter's night. Wagons weren't exactly designed for interior fire usage, but when your nose is colder than a lake trout's handshake, you consider your options. The Clarks, being pragmatic people and particularly fond of their eyebrows, had warmed bricks near the fire outside earlier that evening and wrapped them in cloth to serve as fireside surrogates in bed. Not quite high-tech geothermal heating, but it beat nothing, and it kept toes from declaring mutiny. And just when the wind grew tired of its own screaming and began to whimper into silence, the absolute stillness of snow-covered wilderness settled around them like a second blanket. One cold, one comforting, both magnificent. Inside the wagon, breaths slowed. The fire outside had died. Buttons sighed, deeply content. Somewhere above the whisper of sleeping children and creaking timbers, an owl hooted its soft approval. And the pioneer night, unimaginably cold, surprisingly warm, pressed on. In the quiet hush, the Clark family dreamed of spring, of green meadows still 1,000 miles away, and of the morning pancakes if the flour hadn't frozen again. The wind moaned like an old man with creaky knees, curling its icy breath beneath the canvas folds of the wagon. It found every gap, every seam not battened down with hand-stitched resolve. Outside, the Great Plains had turned into a frozen sea of white, and the moon, hiding behind a thick quilt of storm clouds, dared not peek. Time on the trail was usually measured in dust and wheel ruts, but on nights like these, it was marked by the sound of frost collecting on eyelashes and the slow, symphonic creaking of wagon wood expanding and contracting in the cold. Inside, families became experts in makeshift insulation. Blankets weren't just bedding. They were currency, privacy curtains, portable walls, and in a pinch, impromptu baby hammocks. Every rag had value. Spare shirts were tucked into drafty corners, and if you were lucky enough to have a patch of buffalo hide, well, you were practically aristocracy, though with notably worse smell. Most wagons were tighter than a librarian's purse strings, roughly 4 feet wide by 10 feet long, and packed tighter than a holiday turkey with supplies. Flour, a cast-iron Dutch oven or two, dried beans, bacon, more salt than pig really, and hopefully something that resembled coffee. And then, amid all that, a family, parents, children, a few interpretive chickens, and if you were particularly forward-thinking, a cat to keep the rodents honest. Sleeping arrangements were less cozy cottage and more stacked like firewood. If there were babies, they were swaddled and tucked under the arms of the warmest adult. Children starfished across her laps, and someone always volunteered to sleep nearest the canvas wall, the coldest and most thrilling position, often assigned curiously to the cousin who complained the most. The hierarchy was strict but unspoken. Like any well-run society, warmth distribution was governed by maternal instinct, sheer physical mass, and how much you had irritated the group during the day. For warmth, few things beat human proximity, a fact the Donner Party would later tragically misunderstand. But in more wholesome examples, cuddling was less romantic and more survivalist. Folks would wake up stiff, drooling onto a sibling's socked foot, startled by the sound of icicles forming outside. But they woke up alive, mostly. The laughter helped. Even in the middle of a blizzard, someone always had a riddle or a story, or a new way to describe the sound of Uncle Melvin's snores. The scraping of wind against the wagon was sometimes overshadowed by whispered jokes, or the muffled thump of a younger child dreaming themselves right off their sleeping mat and into a sack of potatoes. The storm outside might rage, frost might grip the axles and hold them hostage till morning, but inside, folks carried on. They were a humming little society in canvas wombs, weathering the elements with ingenuity, stubbornness, and a mutual agreement to ignore the smell of someone's feet until after spring thaw. Some passengers boasted sod burners, small, enclosed metal stoves made to heat things just enough not to become icicles, while simultaneously posing a mild threat to everyone's eyebrows. These stoves ran on buffalo chips, dried prairie grass, and optimism, and they filled wagons with a gentle, smoky haze many would later describe as rustic, while privately coughing into handkerchiefs. But for all the smoke and the sloshing of lukewarm mush in weather-beaten tin bowls, the warmth was real. Meals interrupted by howling wind still nourished. Bedtime stories, half lost in a gale, still calmed small hearts. A snowstorm was no one's idea of a good night, but it was a reminder, a frigid, frozen prod, that life on the trail wasn't about comfort. It was about persistence. Pausing to wait out a storm, huddled like penguins atop leftover biscuit tins and cracked fiddle cases, was just another page in a story that spanned generations. And when the wind finally shifted and snow stopped whispering against the wagon's canvas like some ghostly hand brushing past a curtain, silence came. Heavy, whole fringe of heaven's silence. That's how they knew the storm had ended. Not with fanfare, but with the gift of stillness. Soon, someone would peek outside to see the wagon buried up to its hubs and sigh the long-suffering sigh of someone who knows they'll be digging with a butter tin and a cheerful lie about progress. But first, they would sleep, with the breath of their family rising and falling like tides in the shared dark. Somewhere, Coyote howled, not ominously, but more like he was practicing or trying to remember the beginning of an old cowboy ballad. And inside the wagon, a child mumbled something about pancakes in their sleep, just as an ember softly blinked out in the stove, leaving warmth echoing behind it. Tomorrow would bring shovels, soggy gloves, and oatmeal that defied description. But for now, for tonight, the storm had passed. And that, well, that was enough to dream on. Outside, the wind was still sulking like a child who had been told no, and the snow continued its quiet argument with the ground, layers upon layers of white disagreement. Inside the covered wagon, however, time bent itself delicately, like a cat curling beside the hearth. The hard wooden floor creaked softly beneath woolen socks and patchwork quilts, but it was a familiar sound, almost as comforting as the lull of drifted snow brushing against the canvas siding. In those prairie winters, the wagon became less a vehicle and more a ship, navigating an ocean of snowbanks. The families who lived in them did not so much survive as they adapted with the slow, unhurried stubbornness of people who had chosen to build a life in the middle of nowhere on purpose. Because when you moved west in the 1800s, no one told you the fine print, that you'd occasionally be sharing a living room with a goat, 5 children, and a block of frozen lard that was supposed to be dinner. The day's labor ceased shortly after sundown, not because the to-do list was complete, heavens no, but because human fingers have a finite tolerance for frostbite. The ever-useful oil lantern, with its smoky glow and near-religious importance, was hauled from its hook and placed at the center of the wagon's modest universe. It lit up the space in golden half-circles, casting long, cozy shadows onto the canvas walls like a flickering puppet show. And every person performed their evening role with a quiet grace forged by repetition. And probably chilblains. The youngest of the children might be entrusted with the noble task of buttoning the flaps shut. Not using zippers, those hadn't yet intrigued the Victorian imagination, but toggles, ties, and flaps closed, using a system so complex it could have inspired modern origami. The eldest, meanwhile, would shovel their way through small drifts of snow that had found their way inside, despite best efforts. Snow has a personality, if you're patient enough to notice. It's persistent, snobby, and absolutely determined to audition for the role of indoor decoration. The family dog, should one be part of the expedition, would curl underneath the wagon's bench, like a furry furnace with a single mission: stay warm, say nothing. Cats, if they existed on the journey, acted as they always do, aloof, undecided, and entirely sure that this whole wagon situation was beneath them. Now to supper, a grand term, considering nightly options included salt pork, dry biscuits, and the occasional miracle of canned peaches if a merchant had felt charitable some months back. Rehydrated beans featured often, as did stews of questionable water origin. These dinners weren't made to thrill. They were made to keep human beings alive long enough to tell their grandchildren stories about how thrilling it all was. Even during storm nights, someone always played music, a harmonica usually, or a fiddle that had been passed down through generations like a slightly flat-voiced ancestor. The sound of music in a tiny wagon, pressed against the howling nothingness outside, was something between defiance and lullaby. It stitched together the world, note by note. And in that cramped warmth, stories returned. Not stories from books, because books were rare, and when used too often, they tended to be recycled into kindling or very ambitious toilet paper. Oral histories took center stage. Tall tales, frontier legends, recent mishaps rebranded as comedic lore. Oh yes, the legend of Pa falling butt first into the water trough became infinitely funnier when the wind rattled the sides of the wagon like laughter. Children, wrapped up tighter than burritos, though significantly less delicious, would try to whisper just a bit longer. The wagon, with its parents and siblings, smelled of wood smoke, wool, and honest effort. It was an aroma you couldn't bottle but would remember forever. Sleep came, slowly, like molasses left outside in January. First to the little ones, then to Ma and Pa, who had each become proficient in the fine art of pretending they weren't cold. The fire in the stove dwindled to a soft ruby glow, and the storm outside began to hush, as if it too had tired itself out arguing with the night. And just before everything fell into stillness, Perhaps the eldest child lay blinking under a quilt, stitched with the fabric of old shirts, wondering what would happen once the storm passed, and whether the door flap had actually been tied properly this time. But the wind answered softly, promising one more secret of survival, waiting just beyond the next horizon of dreams. They say necessity is the mother of invention, and nowhere was that truer than inside a covered wagon during a howling prairie blizzard. When the wind shrieked like a banshee with frozen lungs and the snow piled up like flour sacks around the wheels, families didn't panic. They blanketed ingenuity with quilts and stuffed it into every corner. Now, the average covered wagon was roughly the size of a large family dining table with ambitions. Wooden ribbed and canvas covered, it wasn't so much a mobile home as a glorified wooden basket with wheels. These wagons had about 4 feet of headroom, unless your family valued spinal alignment, which was considered extravagant. But in storm conditions, the wagon wasn't just transportation. It was everything: shelter, pantry, nursery, and, in a pinch, confessional booth. When the blizzard set in and the world outside turned into spinning sugar, the whole family squeezed inside like socks in a tightly packed drawer. There were no designated bedrooms, no curated hygge decor, just people, blankets, and maybe an anxious goat, if she hadn't wandered off the previous night in search of a less wintry eternity. The first order of business was plugging every tiny gap that let wind in. Snow could blow horizontally in a good old-fashioned prairie gale, and if there were even a finger-width gap between wood and canvas, nature would find it and poke it relentlessly. Families used spare shirts, pieces of axe-worn fabric, dried corn husks, and once, according to an affectionate third-hand diary quote, one entire pickle barrel lid to block drafts. The canvas top, stretched tight over wooden balls, might as well have been made of frosted lace once the snow started falling. Yet, a decent oilcloth treatment and a stack of patchy quilts could make it reasonably snug. Warmth, however, was a more complicated affair. Fire, as you might guess, was ideal, but tragically incompatible with flammable canvas and crowded sleeping arrangements. Thus, the human furnace model was employed. Everybody slept together: mama, papa, children, baby, maybe grandma if she didn't snore like a foundry bellows, all piled into a centralized warmth pod. Blankets were layered like sedimentary rock formations, usually wool, sometimes homespun, and in desperate cases, a bearskin faded from countless grim pioneer-hugging rituals. The warmth didn't just come from bodies. Cast iron stoves were sometimes carried on the wagon's tailgate, practical for cooking, but truly the aristocrats of heated luxury. Someone had to stoke it constantly if it was running, meaning at least one unlucky soul was on fire watch, bleary-eyed and muttering, while the rest drooled contentedly into shared flannel. But not all families brought stoves. Some packed heated stones from the evening's fire under the blankets. These stones were safety tested by pioneers who had once burned sock holes trying to warm their toes. After a few tragic flaming mitten incidents, they learned: wrap each in burlap and don't cuddle them like teddy bears. Fevered rocks were placed strategically at the foot of the sleeping heap, radiating heat in a way that was, by comparison, remarkably charming. Cold toes were not the only risk. Condensation from many humans breathing in close quarters led to droplets forming on the inside of the canvas. This could make mornings feel like waking up inside a particularly damp loaf of bread. Parents solved this with strict nose-pointing outwards policies and a communal respect for not breathing too enthusiastically. As for food during a blizzard, There was no going outside to rustle up a venison roast, no dashing to the root cellar for parsnips. What you had under the wagon seat, that was dinner. Dried beans, hardtack, a lonely piece of jerky still shaped, like Uncle Eli's boot, and perhaps apples wrapped in paper to last the season. Meals were reinvented with creativity bordering on hallucination. Johnny cake crumbs could become cornmeal stew when floated in hot water with a whisper of salt and a spoonful of familial delusion. But in spite of the cramped quarters, the chill, and the existential questioning of whether snow could, in fact, develop a personality, the family bond inside the wagon was ironclad. There was music too, quiet lullabies, softly sung hymns, a harmonica if one was lucky, or the rhythmic snoring of the youngest as accompaniment. History rarely mentions the warmth of that sound, but it soothed better than any lullaby printed in a songbook. And somewhere in the night, as snow blanketed the world into stillness, sleep crept across that bundle of travelers. The wind outside moaned its operatic sympathy, but inside, surrounded by wool, breath, and a soft murmur of dreams, the night became quiet. Next, if the ice snow ever let them, they'd have to figure out how to unfreeze a wagon wheel. But that's a tale trailing along tundra tracks, further down the frosted path. As day faded into evening, and the snow outside drifted in deeper, hushier layers, the inside of a covered wagon became something like the inside of a whisper. A cold whisper, yes, but a whisper nonetheless. Life didn't stop just because winter arrived with all the subtlety of a bison in a bonnet. Families tucked themselves into canvas cocoons and found ways to hibernate in motion. Inside the wagon, space was measured not in feet, but in elbows. Elbows which, by nightfall, had discovered the ribs, knees, and occasionally nostrils of other family members. Beds, such as they were, consisted of buffalo hides, increasingly flattened feather ticks stuffed with whatever nature and optimism allowed, and every trustworthy scrap of fabric not currently serving as someone's shirt or half a curtain. Now imagine 7 people nestled, like a human pot of stew around a single iron stove barely bigger than a biscuit tin. This was the Franklin stove, or sometimes a box stove, which was named not for its shape but for what the family hoped it would provide. A box filled with heat, dreams, and perhaps an occasional roasted parsnip. Getting a fire going inside one of these wagons in a snowstorm required equal parts skill, tenacity, and an astonishing tolerance for the smell of charred goat hair. Fuel was scarce. Buffalo chips, hunks of dried grass twisted like pretzels, or prairie coal, which was a nice way of referring to questionable clumps of mystery sediment someone's uncle insisted could burn. But burn it did, and as the fire sparked to life and spirits curled open like thawing fingers, the interior of the wagon filled with the pungent perfume of survival. The stove let off just enough warmth to keep noses from freezing. Most of the time, those not lucky enough to sleep close by its tin belly often woke up dusted in frost, their breath puffing gently, like small clouds of complaint in a language only winter understands. For entertainment, families had 2 primary options: storytelling or experimental attempts at indoor whittling. Storytelling won the popularity contest, though only barely. Grandfather might recount the tale of meeting a bear in the woods and politely declining to be eaten, while little ones sat wide-eyed beneath patchwork quilts that had more patches than quilt by this stage. Mothers told folk tales from back east, while fathers, when not shining their buttons with a sock, would warn children about the dangers of sleepwalking into the snow while sleep insulting local wildlife. There were games too. Guess that animal by smell, was less a game and more an unavoidable side effect of insulation and livestock proximity. But there were quieter amusements, string games, buttons on string games, the ever-popular poke your sibling and pretend it was a spider game, timeless classics of long winters and limited personal space. Food, meanwhile, became an imaginative affair. Beans were always on the menu, sometimes partnered with the ghost of a ham bone or suspiciously optimistic turnips. Dried apples were a luxury, as was flour that didn't taste faintly of the sack it arrived in. Ma would sometimes fry dough on the stove, known affectionately as settler donuts or happiness circles if you'd gone too long without sugar and needed convincing. Keeping water from freezing was an art involving wrapping canteens in quilts and storing them under beds or even inside clothing. No one talked much about that winter when Uncle Silas woke up wearing a frozen sock hat made entirely of last night's leftovers. Sometimes comfort came not from warmth or full bellies, but from shared absurdity, and the knowledge that at least everyone was cold and grumpy together. Through it all, the wind moaned outside like a homesick fiddle. Snow fell in soft sighs. The canvas roof swayed ever so gently, singing lullabies taught to it by the prairie winds. Inside, amid fidgety sleep and gentle snores, the family dreamed, not of fine houses or hot baths necessarily, but of surviving one more night together. And as a moonbeam slid across the canvas top like a lazy thought, tomorrow slowly unfurled in the distance, and starlight hinted at the curious ways families faced not just cold, but boredom, with something approaching genius. And so, with snow piling against the canvas sides of the wagon like a determined pastry chef, trying to frost the whole world at once, the family nestled into what could only be generously called blizzard mode. The grub box became a footstool. The water barrel turned into a snow seat. And Grandma's rocking chair, lashed to the wagon's back wall, developed an alarming yet oddly soothing creak, which sounded precisely like a sighing chicken. Now, one of the more quaintly heroic features of the Pioneer family was their spectacular knack for making absolutely everything useful. If something wasn't immediately edible or burnable, they'd still try to wear it as a hat. This resourcefulness bloomed especially during snowstorms, the charming kind of survival improvisation that comes only from sheer necessity and a mild underestimation of how cold things can actually get when your roof is made of wood, canvas, and a strong sense of optimism. To warm their sleeping quarters, the wagon's crowded, hay-sprinkled belly, the family might bring in a warmed brick or two, heated earlier in the fire and wrapped like sleepy loaves of bread in cloth. These humble heat bricks were tucked into bedding like polite guests, radiating 30 minutes of luxury before cooling politely into regret. Some wagons had little tin stoves bolted down for warmth, although trusting fire inside your wooden box on wheels during a windstorm seemed, at best, enterprising and slightly perilous. But folks were careful, or at least creatively cautious, positioning the stove near the middle, flanking it with pans of snow, and giving everyone an informal lesson in, if the smoke turns black, we open the flap. The children often served as early warning smoke detectors, due to their extremely low tolerance for smoky air and high tendency to complain artistically. Clothing, meanwhile, became an endeavor of layered ambition. Woolen underthings, scratchy and unflinching, were the base coat. Then came shirts, sweaters, scarves, aprons used as second shawls, feather-stuffed petticoats, and socks boldly worn as mittens in defiance of glove shortages and social norms. You wouldn't recognize your cousin Emily under 3 mufflers and a curtain that had been rebranded as a winter veil. But she was in there somewhere, probably reading the Bible by candlelight and quietly wondering if toes were supposed to tingle that long. Let us take a moment to honor the poor candle, the pioneer's mighty, flickering flame. In the still, frigid nights, it cast shadows that turned boots into goblins and sleeping family members into oddly shaped loaves of furniture, kept in lanterns or stuck into potatoes for stability, a trick both illuminating and delicious in theory. The candle was asked to do the heavy work of morale. It lit up letters from home, warmed chilled fingers, and flickered agreeably during long stories about ghosts, signs from God, and the occasional anecdote about that one cousin who accidentally shot his own boot and blamed a raccoon. Because of course, there were stories. Snowed in with very little to do. Television being a mere twinkle in the century's eye, and TikTok, not even a glimmer in the dreaming minds of future time wasters. Families resorted to a time-honored tradition, wildly embellishing stories they'd already told 12 times. Grandparents might launch into a tale about the Great Missouri Flood, only now it featured a horse who could tappy, dance, and a barge full of pickles that mysteriously vanished. The blizzard transformed the wagon into a tiny theatre of imagination, wrapped in frost. Children listened wide-eyed, wedged between hay bales and biscuit tins, clutching rag dolls or whittled toys carved by someone whose knowledge of animal anatomy was enthusiastic but inaccurate. These toys became characters, sidekicks, heroes in the tundra tale being spun. And in this cocoon of chill and chatter, time softened like snow on the wagon's canvas roof. Outside, the storm would rage, howling as if heaven were rearranging furniture. But inside, there was warmth. Not the kind measured by thermometers, perhaps, but the kind measured in shared blankets, companionship, and the soup slowly thickening on the tin stove. And just as the wind grew tired of huffing at the world like a ruffled uncle, the family drifted into sleep, children beneath buffalo hide blankets, adults wedged like spoons in the hull of the covered wagon, the only sound the gentle snores and the soft creak of grandma rocking to herself, dreaming of spring mud and blossom days. Soon, as morning crept behind the frost-kissed curtains and brought with it something resembling hope, or at least bacon, we'll see just how these frozen pioneers began their days when the world outside was still a popsicle. But that, dear listener, waits quietly on the snowy edge of dawn. By the time the wind began to howl like a pack of disgruntled coyotes, the Johnson family knew it was going to be one of those nights. You know the kind, when the air itself seems suspicious, like it's cooking up a blizzard behind your back just for the drama of it. The clouds had thickened like poorly whipped cream, and a chill had crept in that no amount of buffalo hides could sweet-talk. Inside their covered wagon, though, a strange and stubborn sort of coziness began to form, like sourdough left next to a fire, slow, warm, and unexpectedly alive. The wagon wasn't particularly roomy by modern standards. If you've ever tried to sleep in a closet with 4 other people and a live chicken, you have the general idea. The space was maybe 4 feet wide, jam-packed with sacks of flour, a few cracked tin plates, an ox yoke, 3 generations of hopes, and several sets of itchy woolen socks that had seen better winters. First came the bedding ceremony, which involved strategic pile layering. One would toss down a sturdy buffalo robe as the baseline, perhaps the 1850s version of memory foam. Then came the feather-stuffed quilts, usually made from whatever fabrics they weren't currently wearing. Finally, everyone would wedge themselves into place like puzzle pieces in poorly tailored long johns. Young Clara was always the first to crawl in. She took burrowing with the seriousness of a badger preparing for tax season. Little Tommy would follow, dragging his corn husk doll and asking questions like, "Can snow bite?" To which his pa would say, "Only if you disrespect it," a wisdom passed down from someone's uncle who once tried to spit into the wind. Next came Ma Johnson, keeper of the potato sack foot warmers and the family's collective patience. She'd make sure the embers from dinner's fire were safely buried out front, the kind of pioneer ritual that both prevented accidents and made Ma feel like she was one step ahead of the night. Once inside, she would hand out warm potato poultices, steamed root vegetables wrapped in cloth that served the dual role of heater and midnight snack. There's something deeply comforting about laying next to your brother, spooning a hot Yukon Gold. As for Pa Johnson, he'd enter last, carefully ducking under the quilted wagon roof. He always seemed larger in the cold, his greatcoat crinkling like frozen leaves. With a sigh as deep as the prairie sky, he'd lower himself into the corner and begin his nightly duty. Storytelling. Pioneer bedtime stories weren't exactly Disney material. Most were mildly unsettling folktales or cautionary yarns involving chores gone awry. But even in that, there was charm. Pa would begin in his slow, low register, recounting the tale of the pancake that escaped the skillet, or the cow that forgot where home was. They were stories soaked in cornmeal and metaphor, where cows represented stubbornness and pancakes symbolized opportunity, and also breakfast. The wind might rattle the canvas above, but inside, the wagon became its own little ecosystem of shared warmth and whispered laughter. Ma would chuckle softly and remind Pa that the cow probably wasn't lost, just ignoring him, as cows tend to do when they've had enough of your nonsense. Clara and Tommy would drift off mid-story, their noses peeking from the blankets like sleepy mice, while outside, snowflakes performed their silent ballet across the plains. The smell inside the wagon was a mix of boiled beans, wool grease, and lye soap. An aroma so distinctly 19th century, it could qualify as a historical artifact. But it was theirs, and it smelled like survival, with a hint of overcooked parsnip. Somewhere near midnight, a loud thump would occasionally sound on the canvas top, an ambitious squirrel or a piece of wind-tossed firewood. No one stirred, not anymore. The family had entered the dream space of the Great Plains, that rhythmic lull of breath and weather where hearts beat slow and dreams wander across leagues of snow. And so, in their tight, warm quarters, surrounded by an outside world that had turned to ice and echo, the Johnson family slipped into a sleep so complete, not even the coyotes dared disturb it. Come morning, they'd wonder if the world had ever truly existed beyond the curve of their canvas roof. And yet, even before the sun returned, something else stirred silently. An ember, a scent, a knock, reminding the sleeping family of what lay just ahead. The wind spoke in whistles that night, curling around the heavy canvas of the covered wagon, like a bored ghost whistling for company. Inside, the family sat bundled in their patched-up layers, looking rather like a collection of laundry bundles with faces. Eyes peeking out from scarves and quilts, noses reddened and rather miffed to be so exposed. The pioneers had their priorities straight. Keep the fire low, the blankets high, and the complaints gently humorous. As the cold pressed its nose against every seam in the wagon, the inside world became a strange sort of universe, its own tiny planet floating in a sea of snow and wind. The lantern swayed faintly, casting golden halos over cast-iron cookware and a stubborn lump of bread dough hiding under a cloth, pretending to rise. In those freezing twilight hours, survival required little rituals. One of the lesser-known but highly effective methods for not turning into a family of pioneer popsicles was something called the hot rock strategy. Before nightfall, children, tiny, cold-resistant humans in training, were sent off to heat large rocks by the fire pit outside. Once properly toasty, these rocks were carefully wrapped in thick flannel or burlap and placed under bedrolls like prehistoric space heaters. It was an energy-efficient system powered by sibling rivalry, as competition to find the best hot rock often led to vigorous searching and occasional debate about what temperature qualified as scorchingly ideal. In fact, pioneers may have been some of the earliest inventors of radiant heat. Who needs modern HVAC systems when you have 12 pounds of granite, a hand-sewn sock, and a healthy mistrust of frostbite? Then came the sleeping formations, beautiful, chaotic arrangements resembling an ambitious quilt fort mixed with livestock strategy. Families didn't just sleep together, they practically nested. The youngest children were usually tucked in the middle, bookended by parents, siblings, or the occasional very confused hound dog. There were few situations more effective for bonding, literally and emotionally, than sharing a buffalo robe with someone whose feet were always suspiciously cold. Sometimes heated disputes would arise, not about politics or religion or how many beans constituted a serving, but rather whose turn it was to sleep near the flap. The back of the wagon, with its slightly less tragic draft, was prime real estate. Whoever ended up by the flap, likely the same person who found the second-rate hot rock, often rebranded themselves as a noble sentry, guarding the edge of the known world. In truth, they lay half asleep, sandwiching their legs between layers of long johns and existential regret. Of course, staying warm wasn't just a physical endeavor, it was mental too. Tall tales became the currency of coziness, and storytelling was the crackling fire that needed no wood. Grandparents, if present, were walking time machines of half-true history and full-bore imagination. Children would sit wide-eyed under quilts as tales of river crossings, haunted valleys, and accidental raccoon encounters filled the cold air with cheerful disbelief. One popular story was about a man who outwitted frostbite by stuffing his boots with roasted turnips. Absurd, absolutely. Effective, possibly once. Memorable, eternally. In the great theatre of frontier entertainment, practicality bowed humbly to creativity. When the crack of the wind grew louder than the stories, music offered its own kind of warmth. Someone might hum a hymn or pluck a banjo string until calluses remembered forgotten tunes. Harmonicas were the smartphones of their day, inexpensive, pocket-sized, easy to lose, and guaranteed to annoy everyone after 10 minutes. But in those long nights when the snow piled high outside and sanity began to gently unravel like a poorly wound skein of wool, even a squeaky rendition of O Susanna could feel like a lullaby. By the time the fire had dwindled to embers and everyone had shuffled into their respectable places in the burrito of family togetherness, there was a quiet hush. The wind still howled, the wagon creaked, but inside dreams floated idly of spring thaws, green valleys, and mornings with no frozen socks. Somewhere, buried beneath potholders and feet, a forgotten sweet potato served as someone's impromptu pillow. A fact no one discovered until breakfast. And just as the cold seemed to tighten its grip on the little canvas world, something curious happened. Snoring. Not fierce, commanding snores, but the soft, overlapping ones that sound a bit like old saddle leather and gently bubbling stew. A sure sign that, despite it all, the night was survivable. Outside, the snow continued to fall in delicate armies, but inside, the wagon had become a fortress of warmth, a triumph not of engineering, but of togetherness, hot rocks, and just the right number of wool socks. Through that frigid cocoon of canvas and dreams, the weary world turned softly toward another dawn. And in the faint warmth of a snoring lullaby, the family slept on, drawn ever deeper into the hush of winter's long night, where, by the way, breakfast preparation was only a few frozen steps away. Snowflakes landed on canvas like ghostly moths, silent as secrets. Inside the covered wagon, the wind's howl became a curious lullaby, not exactly gentle, but oddly rhythmic, as if the blizzard were trying its best to hum a tune through cracked lips. It was only the third hour of nightfall, but the family was already bundled tightly beneath every woolen scrap they owned, nestled together like spoons in a drawer made of quilts and human persistence. Their lantern, sputtering gently with a smoky sigh, cast golden shadows on the wooden ribs of the wagon, making everyone look a little storybookish. Even old Silas, the family's flop-eared beagle, looked regal as he curled under Ma's rocking chair, wearing a bonnet someone had jokingly tied around his neck like a colonial grandmother. One suspects Silas was beyond the vanity of political fashion. You see, when you're in a covered wagon during a prairie whiteout, with nothing but a few split logs for heat and a crusty pot of bean mush for dinner, you need more than just survival instincts. You need imagination, wool, and a rather absurd sense of humor. Tonight's entertainment came in two parts. First, Pa attempted to recite Shakespeare. A tattered almanac's back pages had a few lines from Julius Caesar, or so he claimed. His rendition went something like, "Beware the Ides of Marshmallow," which prompted young Martha to burst into sputtering giggles, the laughter completely derailing the dramatic tension. Not that anyone was particularly worried about Brutus and the Roman Senate, while waiting out a frostbite-inducing tempest in the Wyoming Territory. Part 2 of the show involved sock puppets. Now, socks were rare gold on the trail, so you can imagine the diplomatic summit required to secure a matching pair. Once acquired, two grey woolen characters named Captain Heelspin and Lady Toecliff argued valiantly over who'd stolen the last beef jerky. This was not high drama, but perhaps it was high enough. You'll laugh, but one day someone's going to pay good money to see wool talk, Pa mumbled, eyes twinkling behind frost-lined lashes. Mark my words, next century will be sock theatre's time to shine. The children, half asleep, nodded as if he were Moses descending from Mount Ararat with warm popcorn and a patent for the puppet show. Of course, time would reveal he was both wildly wrong and endearingly right. The family followed a long-practiced bedtime routine that required impressive spatial choreography, in a space no bigger than a large walk-in closet, and one that's being gently buffeted by Mother Nature's least favorite mood swing. They managed a sort of nightly ballet. First, boots came off and were tucked under the wagon bench to prevent freezing to the floor, which had happened once and traumatized Pa's toes for a fortnight. Then coats became blankets, blankets became tents, and someone, inevitably, knocked over the water bucket, which sounded like a small landslide to everyone soundly dozing. They'd learned not to light fires directly in the wagon. Smoke and canvas do not get along. But they did eat stones in the makeshift fire pit outside and wrap them in thick cloth to bring inside. These served as rudimentary bed warmers, though they cooled faster than the laughter of a Puritan joke teller. Still, the stones were a small pleasure. akin to holding hands with geology. Sleep came slowly but surely, especially when Ma started humming that low, long lullaby passed down from her own mother, which migrated from the Scottish Highlands through Appalachia and finally into that wind-rocked wagon. It sounded like molasses pouring, slow, sweet, and a little sticky on the soul. The tune had no name, just a comfort, older than maps. From somewhere near the flap, the wind shifted and brought the scent of pine smoke. Perhaps another family nearby, hunkered down in their own wooden turtle shell. There was something soothing about the thought. They weren't quite alone. They were part of a larger patchwork. Travelers, dreamers, wagon dwellers all huddled against the same starless night. As Ma's lullaby faded into a hum, and Pa snored in the peculiar rhythm of a man who once swallowed a harmonica reed, the children drifted into dreamland, a place with warm eggs and warmer beds, where canvas roofs leaked only sunshine, and blizzards were dramatized solely by sock puppets. Somewhere beyond the next snowy ridge, dawn was yawning into her coat, and a new plan for stew would soon be whispered by firelight. As snow collected like powdered sugar on the canvas roof of the wagon, the family inside had long since settled into their practiced winter rhythm, a sort of drowsy ballet that had been perfected through necessity and repetition. Damp socks drying over the stove, mittens strung like festive garlands from wagon beam to wagon beam, and someone always bumping their head on the low ceiling while trying to get more beans. Now, you might assume that days spent trapped in a wooden box on wheels would drive people mildly insane, or at the very least, encourage a game of charades to spiral dramatically. But families back then had something stronger than entertainment. They had routine, which, as any sleep-loving historian will tell you, is comfort's quieter, more reliable cousin. Each evening, once the floor had been cleared of its daily layer of melting snow, firewood splinters, and biscuit crumbs, the central stove gave a groan as if aware it had many hours of duty ahead. Wagons weren't insulated. At best, they were wind-resistant, but the little iron stove in the middle of the space did its best. It puffed and glowed, radiating warmth that barely reached the far corners before promptly giving up, like an overworked teacher counting the minutes until recess. The children, swaddled in so many layers they resembled morally upright marshmallows, typically fell asleep first. Parents tucked them into bedrolls laid atop hay-stuffed mattresses. The hay crackled, sometimes created questionable smells, but it was soft, softish, and it trapped heat better than even the bravest quilt. And then came the storytelling. Ah yes, the great blizzard tales before bed. Every family had one. Some were finely tuned stories passed down through generations, and others were suspiciously similar to stories told by other families, with a few personalized details added about cousin Hezekiah's heroism, or how little Minnie once punched a raccoon. These tales weren't merely bedtime amusements. They were cultural glue. In a world where entertainment had to be handmade or goat-chewed, stories became insulation for the soul. One popular tale that bobbed around wagon circles like the last biscuit in a pot of stew was The Ghost of the Broken Axle. It involved a ghost, naturally, which only appeared during snowstorms and only when all the axles on the wagon were still in working order. If your axle broke, the ghost would disappear, clearly disappointed that it had no role to play. Children found this hilarious. Parents perhaps found it too relatable. Adults, meanwhile, found comfort in routine tasks, even during storms. After the children were tucked in and the fire had been bribed into continuing its glow, Mothers and fathers often pored over mended socks, waxed boots, stitched journal pages, or, if they were truly lucky, simply held hands beneath a quilt, a rare, quiet comfort wrapped in wool and silence, and then silence would fall. Outside, the wind moaned across the plains like a musician trying to tune an ill-tempered cello. Snowflakes ticked gently on the canvas, tarp overhead, like tiny white moths knocking to ask if anyone still needed a chill. Inside, lantern light flickered across faces that looked older at night, lined with fatigue but softened by warmth and fire glow. Wooden beams creaked slightly, a familiar lullaby for settlers everywhere, reminding them that they had survived another day. No small feat, really, when your walls are made of fabric and your nearest neighbor is 3 frozen cows away. Sometimes, usually the father, would do one last check before crawling into bed. He'd poke his head out the flap into the howl of frozen air, curse softly under his breath at the snowdrift height, and then quickly retreat, muttering affirmations like, "Well, still there," or the ever-popular "could be worse." And then the wagon slumbered. Blankets rose and fell in slow, dreamy rhythm. The stove glowed its final embers of the night like a tired sentinel. In the pale blue dark, one might think there was no life here at all. But inside, against all odds, people breathed and dreamed and hoped their bread wouldn't freeze overnight again. Out there, nothing but wind and white. But in here, bundled in straw and whispers, a strange, sturdy kind of peace. The sort you don't expect, but comes anyway. Because humans are just that good at making nests out of nearly nothing. And while the moon sketched frosty shadows across the wagon's gently domed ceiling, the wind whispered the beginning of a different kind of hush, one that would carry the family into their next day, drift by drift, flake by flake. Tomorrow would bring, well, you'll see soon enough. The wind had all the manners of a cranky violinist, sharp, shrill, and determined to be heard. Its bow scraped unrelentingly across the prairie, whistling at seams in canvas and rattling at every bone-thin crevice in the sides of a wagon. But inside, under a patchwork of quilts, wool, and the weary hush of breath, families were wrapped tighter than pickles in a barrel. Nighttime during a prairie blizzard inside a covered wagon was less about sleep and more about strategic huddling. Everyone became an amateur philosopher of body heat, especially the children, who were seen as excellent portable embers. A warm child was placed like a hot brick in bedrolls or pressed tactically between parents, the original and greatest invention of thermodynamic bunking. To stay warm without burning down their very wooden homes on wheels, wagoners relied on preparation and peckish caution. Before sundown, adults would feed the small iron stove as if it were a grumpy deity, with a diet of corn cobs and buffalo chips. Yes, exactly the kind of chip you're imagining. Dried fuel of any sort was a gift from the landscape, no matter how unglamorous. At night, the stove, if blessedly operable, would be shut down early for safety, leaving behind a fading ghost of warmth and the unmistakable scent of smoked biscuits and singed hope. Preserving, body heat turned into something of a pastime. Woolen garments were layered in an orderless fashion that made everyone look pleasantly lumpy, like ambulatory sacks of flour. Stockings were rarely removed. Removing socks in a wagon mid-winter blizzard was considered dramatic and dangerous, like exposing ankle at a Victorian dinner party, scandalous and likely to result in frostbite. Now, let's take a moment to talk about feather ticks. No, not woodland pests with ambitions. These were heavy feather-stuffed quilts, so dense they could humble a sandbag in a wind tunnel. Used by many families with the good fortune or foresight to pack them, feather ticks were not only warm, they were community gathering spots. Once under a feather tick, no one left. You could lose siblings in one corner for days. Metaphorically, of course, hopefully. And oh, the ingenuity of insulating. Quilts were hung on the wagon walls like colourful makeshift tapestries, not for art, but to stop the wind from interrogating every nail seam and wooden plank. Some families even rolled up extra clothes and wedged them around the wheels and under the canvas flaps, creating a snugger seal. Others piled snow against the bottom of wagons, not unlike making a cool weather igloo to hug the wagon's base, a technique that baffled cattle but kept the floor slightly less glacial. Let us not forget the nocturnal entertainment. Stories were treasured currency, especially when the world howled outside and toes began unionizing for warmth. Parents told tales by lantern light, the flame wobbling with every gust, making shadows on the canvas writhe like ancient storytellers dancing with the wind. Some tales were borrowed from books, others invented on the spot, often influenced by an overabundance of bean stew and a surplus of imagination. In that tiny, movable cocoon, children listened wide-eyed to tales of ghost herders, haunted prairies, and a chicken that could lay square eggs. Fiction blended into fatigue, soothed by the slow lull of familiar voices. If a family had an instrument, a fiddle, a harmonica, or even just a particularly musical cough, they might play a tune soft enough not to invite frost in for a listen. Music, like warmth, was rationed but sacred. And so, in the plush dark of a storm-wrapped wagon, the night settled in. The wind grew tired of its performance and sulked off elsewhere. Silence crept in, thick as a woolen sock. Rest came not in perfect stretches, but in drowsy fragments, shared snuggles, and dreams swathed in canvas and snow. Somewhere, under the sigh of a sleeping baby and the hum of the iced prairie, sleep finally stitched everyone together. Just beyond the folds of fraying fabric and beside a stash of hidden peppermint drops, the dawn creaked softly at the edges of the storm, preparing to stretch its pale light over the white blanketed horizon. That winter wind had a cunning way of sneaking into places it wasn't invited, whistling under wagon canvas, pressing icy fingers into mittens, and nosing into every crack between wooden boards and frostbitten boots. It was the sort of wind that didn't bother knocking because it already knew the door was just a flap of oiled cloth. And on nights like these, families bundled under quilts, huddled together like a half-dozen spoons in a drawer, trying to keep warm and stay not frozen. Inside each prairie schooner, those rolling wooden cocoons creaking softly under the weight of snow and dreams, you'd find bodies tucked in like sardines stitched with wool. Parents usually slept at the outer edges, their backs pressing against the canvas and clapping politely at the wind's attempts to sneak in. Children were arranged down the center, like a little row of baked potatoes, small, hot, full of complaints, and steaming when unwrapped. They slept in layers, clothing, then blankets, then more clothing, and occasionally a protesting cousin if one happened to be visiting from the next wagon over. The average family bed was less of a bed and more of an enthusiastic pile. You might wake up to find your face in someone's armpit and your feet wrapped in your aunt's shawl. There were no rules, only warmth. Every so often, one brave soul, likely the father, occasionally a stoic 12-year-old, with a chip on their shoulder and something to prove, had to poke a nose out under the wagon flap and check the horses. This was the wilderness ritual known as abandoning warmth and briefly questioning your life choices. Horses had a habit of either wandering off or freezing solid, and neither option was ideal when your long-term plan involved arriving somewhere that wasn't covered in 20 inches of snow. So out they go, lantern in hand or teeth clenched around a candle stub, squinting through a swirl of frosty lace while muttering words not usually included in the family Bible. If the horses were still upright and breathing, the mission was considered a rousing success. If not, it became more complicated, requiring neighbors, rope, and several lengthy sighs. Back in the wagon, the inside air quickly grew heavy with shared breath, stew fumes, and the occasional wool sock that had seen better days. Windows were not a feature in these wagons. Viewing the blizzard was not a beloved evening pastime, so instead, people relied on the creak of trees and the occasional hoot of owls to lull them into sleep, or vigilance. For light, some kept a small oil lantern burning low in one corner, throwing flickering shadows across the ceiling like fireflies telling ghost stories. Others relied solely on the faint amber glow of the stove, if they were lucky enough to have one installed. Tiny iron stoves vented through the wagon cover were the Cadillac of frontier luxury. They gobbled up wood faster than an annoyed beaver, but they gave warmth that felt like heaven. Families lucky enough to have one might gather round it nightly, like pilgrims at a sacred shrine, hands outstretched, narrating tales and sometimes just sighing in bodily gratitude. And oh, the stories. Tales unfurled like patchwork quilts, stitched from memory, rumor, and well-meaning exaggeration. The father might tell of the time he wrestled a badger, which over several winters morphed into a bear, then finally a two-headed wolf with eyes like lanterns. Children passed down second-hand tales about snowmen that walked, owls that whispered secrets, and wolves that knew how to open latches. Whether these were true didn't matter. What mattered was that they were warm. Food was slim pickings during blizzards. Butter froze. Beans turned to tiny edible rocks. Cold biscuits could be used as building materials. Still, mothers performed tender little miracles with what was available. Boiling dried fruit, warming cornmeal mush, and swearing that yes, this was definitely the exact same peach cobbler recipe that Grandma made back east. Somehow, the taste of love and hunger was close enough on the tongue. By midnight, breath turned the inside of the canvas into a landscape of sparkling ice pearls. Children snored in various pitches, from squeaky fiddle to full tuba. The stove embers hummed a soft lullaby to the wind, and even the scowling wind, tired of being ignored, began to soften its howls. Outside, the prairie slept beneath its snowy quilt. Inside, with the last candle flickering out, the wagons held their small tribes of humans together, sharing stories, heat, and dreams of meadows not yet buried in white. Through it all, they endured, not with grand heroics, but with borrowed quilts, shared spoons, and unshakable stubbornness. And as the wind curled again around the wagon wheels, whispering through the grasses like a nosy aunt, one of those small baked potato children stirred in their blanket pile, eyes fluttering open just in time to hear the start of a song drifting from the next wagon over, a slow, sweet lullaby in a voice worn soft by the snow. As evening shadows stretched long across the snow-veiled prairie, the inside of a covered wagon transformed from a drafty rectangle of canvas and wood into something closer to a cramped mountain lodge. If that lodge was full of people who hadn't bathed in a week, with a strong smell of boiled beans lingering in the air, and absolutely no indoor plumbing. Still, given the blizzard howling just outside the flapping wagon flaps, it qualified as luxury. The pioneers had a term for these nights. They'd call it hunkering, a word as round and soft as a wool sock stuffed into a leather boot. Hunkering wasn't just sitting, it was surviving, snuggling, and staring blankly into the flickering lamplight as your cousin practiced yet another harmonica tune with only 4 notes. They were not the right 4 notes exactly, but this was not an era known for its musical options. Now, the first layer of surviving a blizzard night in a cupboard wagon was fashion. Not fashion in the modern sense. No one was out here strutting prairie catwalks in buffalo fur peacoats, but in the sense of what you could pile onto your body that might trick it into holding onto heat. Wool was king. You might be 3 flannels deep, with a scratchy long john situation that refused to cooperate with the notion of comfort in any way. Stockings over socks, over foot rags, tucked into boots that were, on average, 73% dry on a good day. And for the truly cutting edge, a hat, indoors. Every grandmother worth her weight in sourdough starter insisted on wearing one to bed. The bedding was elaborate in its own dishevelled glory. You wouldn't find any monogrammed duvets here, but you might sleep beneath 2 buffalo hides, a moth-bitten quilt, a canvas flower sack bag, and Susanna's accidentally shredded petticoat. Layers applied more for insulation than dignity. Warmth took precedence over presentation, which is probably how Uncle Caleb ended up using a cured ham as a footrest. And the fire. You might be wondering what fueled such a blaze inside the wagon. The answer is, there wasn't one. Open flames plus canvas equals a late-night lesson in risk management. Most wagons stayed fire-free indoors, but that didn't mean the cooking stove wasn't trying to be the unsung hero of frontier heating. Some enterprising souls dragged a cast iron stove just inside the wagon doorway. It was risky, yes. Smoky, very. Legal. The prairie had no zoning board, so who's to say? Of course, staying warm was only half the battle. The other half was staying sane. Blizzards had a way of making people introspective, or worse, inspired. Many a pioneer diary began with noble thoughts like, Day 11 of Snow Prison. Carl has started speaking in bread metaphors, and ended with passages that read like weather-beaten manifestos against sleet. Inside the wagon, activities abounded. Children crafted dolls out of bundled rags and feverish imagination. Adults compared biscuit recipes with the competitiveness of Olympic fencers. And elders took to telling stories that may or may not have been true, involving suspiciously heroic versions of their younger selves, and at least one bear encounter per tale. Board games, as we know them, didn't exist, unless you count a game called Who Took the Last Dry Sock, or Guess Where the Cabbage Smell is Coming From. Yet families found ways to entertain. Word games, storytelling chains, or dramatic reenactments of that one time the ox almost turned left when you told him to turn right. Even the livestock huddled. Underneath the wagon or in makeshift lean-tos, oxen, goats, and the extremely judgmental chickens all braved the chill. Animals grew fluffier, hooves grew frostier, and somewhere, one cow grew bolder and began staring directly into the wagon like a woolly, judgmental neighbor. Outside, the blizzard never tired. It roared and danced and buried everything familiar in a theater of white. Inside, breaths fogged the air, cheeks turned rosy, and human bodies, packed close as spoons in an old drawer, generated just enough warmth to make another hour bearable, then another. And so the night pressed on, not with silence, but with the soft rustle of blankets, the whisper of snow against canvas, and the low, drowsy hum of families promising, without fully believing, it couldn't storm forever. which leads us, as promised, to the next challenge that awaited wagon families after a long night of thundersnow and too many socks, waking up to find every single item they owned encased in ice. As the wind howled outside the canvas walls and the stars played hide and seek behind thick drifts of white, the inside of the covered wagon turned into something resembling an 1850s version of a Swedish sauna, minus the birch leaves and questionable towel policies. Inside, the air was warm in the center, but dangerously nippy near the edges, and survival depended on two things: proximity and pure, stubborn grit. A frontier family might have up to 10 souls squished into a space smaller than your average minivan trunk, which, let us remember, did not boast heated seats or cup holders. All they had was each other, a lot of quilts, and a level of patience refined by oxen-related delays in the early bedtime. At the heart of the covered wagon was the sleep pile, a sort of communal family huddle that blurred the concepts of personal space and foot smell. Parents, children, and the occasional cousin twice removed were stacked like logs in an old fireplace, facing every direction known to geometry. The youngest child, often still bundled in a too large bonnet or an inexplicably sticky parsnip bib, was given center position. Why? Because they were the portable heaters. Children practically radiated warmth, along with murky smells of molasses and mischief. Parents slept on the outer flanks, bravely serving as buffers to the cold, a kind of human windshield system, while silently questioning their life choices and how many more weeks they'd smell like pickled eggs. To fend off the biting chill, everyone wore layers. Not stylish, Pinterest-worthy layers. We're talking 3-day-old wool, petticoats made from recycled sails, and socks fashioned from the sleeves of Grandpa's retirement shirt. If you ever wondered what it feels like to sleep in a pile of sheep with a light hint of smoked ham, the covered wagon experience could be described as bucolically close. Of course, there was the age-old debate: to sleep with your boots on or off. On one wintry hand, boots provided warmth and protection from surprise rat visits or the occasional wagon jostle. On the other, removing them might spare your family from the scent, which had the sharpness and emotional weight of a Shakespearean tragedy. Many pioneers opted for a compromise, lightly loosening the laces and apologizing to their neighbors in advance. For added heat, some families learned to heat rocks by the fire each evening. These would be wrapped in cloth and cautiously placed near feet or under the quilt, offering toasty comfort and only a mild risk of third-degree burns. But during heavy snowfalls, when lighting a proper fire meant venturing outside and wrestling the wind like it owed you money, this plan was often modified to hug your knees and think warm thoughts, and whisper they did. Quiet chats blossomed in the hush of the wagon. Small voices weaving stories in the shadows, muffled laughter slipping between quilts. Mothers told tales of green farmland waiting just weeks away. Fathers recounted heroic raccoon encounters. Older siblings made up ghost stories, then immediately insisted they weren't scared, even as they slid deeper into the warmth of the pile. Outside, the snow created a thick cocoon around the wagon, muffling the noises of prairie life. Coyotes padded silently in the distance. The wind made curious music along the canvas edges, like a forgotten harmonica humming in its sleep. Sometimes, snow lazily gathered atop the canvased roof, muffling the moonlight and making the wagon feel like the inside of a snowbank, only filled with love, body heat, and the persistent aroma of yesterday's beans. As eyelashes grew heavy and the wagon swayed gently with the prairie breeze, Life on the trail tucked itself in for the night. No lanterns burned, no clocks ticked. Just breath and blankets, the rhythm of rest performed beneath a makeshift roof. Out there in the lonely winter vastness, the quiet could feel deeper than any cathedral and far more honest. A covered wagon wasn't a perfect fortress, but it was a space rimmed in closeness, layered in laughter, and insulated with intention. And just beyond the warmth of the wagon's breath-fogged walls, something else waited quietly under the snow, something waiting patiently until morning light returned to the frozen world. Winter nights on the trail had a peculiar way of expanding time. What would have been a normal evening under a farmhouse roof, supper, stories, bed, turned into a slow-motion ballet of survival and snugness, unfolding in a space roughly the width of a large canoe and only slightly more windproof. Inside one of those canvas-covered domes on wheels, known more memorably as a covered wagon, families became masters of the domestic art of doing a lot with very little. There was barely enough room to sit upright, let alone stretch out with any dignity, and yet, somehow, several souls, plus a dog of questionable manners, would nestle in and call it home, at least for the night. Blankets were not just bedding, they were strategy. Think of them not merely as woolen rectangles, but battlefield tools in the war against cold. That old patchwork quilt your great-great-grandmother sewed. Yes, the one made out of worn-out trousers and the extra parts of shirts that once lost arguments with barbed wire fences. That wasn't just sentiment. It was insulation technology. Quilts, coats, saddle blankets, and any other reasonably clean textile with heft might be layered so generously over the communal pile of humans that if someone rolled over too quickly, they could very well disappear, like a sock lost in the dryer. Only instead of ending up in the laundry abyss, you emerged with a 3-inch icicle for a nose. And then, of course, there was the stove, or more honestly, its smoky, wheezy cousin, the travelling cast iron wood burner. Balanced with grace and optimism in the centre or near the end of the wagon, this tiny contraption did its best to take the edge off the kind of chill that gnawed on your nose hairs. It took a brave soul to climb out into the howling dark to fetch icy logs for it, usually drawn by the short straw or the suffocating sense of heroic masculinity. The rest would burrow deeper into their shared cocoon, whispering, not unkindly, "You've got this, Pa." When fuel was scarce, and it nearly always was, they burned cow chips. Yes, dried cow droppings. Prairie gold, as folks on the frontier learned to call it, renaming the unspeakable into something slightly more cheerful. It produced a heat that was faintly apologetic, but better than freezing solid, and it was smokable, in the technical sense of the word. But the heart of the warmth came not from the stove or the blankets, or even the questionable fire materials, but from each other. Families, bedraggled and bundled, often shared not just body heat, but also laughter, stories, and rumours that peculiar relatives swore were true. Uncle Silas might murmur from beneath 3 shawls and a coonskin hat about the time he outran a bear uphill in a snowstorm, but no one minded the accuracy after the second retelling. Tall tales were as warming as cocoa and with fewer dishes. Sometimes, if the weather sealed them in for days, ice barring the wagon flaps and snow piled up like a bad tax season, they played games with buttons or carved figurines from spare firewood. Children, being the energetic and imaginative creatures that they are, could turn a dangling icicle into Excalibur, goblins, or soup, sometimes all at once. Meals, if you could call them that, were carefully rationed and cleverly disguised as something more exciting. Cold beans in tin pans transformed into frontier fricassee. Stale cornmeal became wagon cake a la snowdrift. The ability to market mush as a delicacy might have been one of the greatest talents of the frontier mother. Truly, there ought to be medals for people who made winter squash at 20 below seem festive, and as the wind howled like a choir of ghosts learning to whistle, and the moon blinked uncertainly through canvas seams rimmed with frost, families drifted into rest, shoulder to shoulder, breath clouding the air, dreams thawing them from the inside out. Sleep, after all, comes surprisingly easy when cold wears you out and stories carry you off. And in that muffled stillness of shared blankets, shared burdens, and one gently leaking stovepipe, they waited for dawn, not eagerly, but patiently. Because the snow might bury your wagon wheels, but so long as everyone squeezed in tight and remembered Aunt Mabel's theories about moonbeams influencing soup, the spirit stayed uncracked. Now, if we listen closely to that creaking wagon frame and the sleepy murmurs tucked under quilts, something else is beginning to stir. A sound more ominous than the wind and more predictable than Pa's snoring. A storm has many moods, and the next one promises to knock politely before letting itself in. But we'll get to that, gently. As the wind howled through the skeletal branches of a frozen cottonwood, the wagon creaked like a symphony of tired fiddles. Inside, the Lambert family huddled like passengers on a peculiar celestial voyage. Not through stars, but snowdrifts. The covered wagon, patched with oilcloth and lined with buffalo hide, had transformed into something between a cramped parlor and an igloo with wheels. Except, of course, less architectural charm and marginally fewer polar bears. By this point in the evening, the game of who can feel their toes longest had lost its appeal. Young Jack had conceded early. He claimed his toes had frozen into the shape of Oregon, though accuracy on that point was debatable. His sister Clara insisted hers were too refined for such dramatics and had kept her feet tucked under their communal cast iron pan, which had been heated with a few coals and a generous helping of parental optimism. Dinner had been a civilized affair by wagon standards. Salt pork sliced so thin it might have been a ghost of itself, rehydrated beans that took longer to chew than to swallow, and a biscuit so sturdy it could repel arrows. They called that one Fort Flour, but in the great winter chapter of wagon life, food was only half the story. The real hero of the evening was, brace yourself, the humble quilt. Not a particularly dashing fellow, but lion-hearted and dependable, passed down for generations and patched with stories instead of patterns. According to Grandmother Lambert, one square had once been a Confederate uniform pocket, repurposed after a particularly awkward family reunion. Another was cut from a pioneer wedding dress worn during a permafrost ceremony, so cold the ink froze in the marriage certificate pen. Quilts traveled almost as far as the families did, stitched in Ohio, carried across Missouri, flapped in the Kansas wind, and now woven like colorful snowdrifts beneath the arched ribs of canvas wagon tops. They covered children, settled disputes over elbow space, and, if the situation called for it, got hoisted like a makeshift wall to block the draft from an especially aggressive blizzard sneeze. Despite the chill outside, inside the tiny wagon world, things were warmer than they seemed. Joseph Lambert, the patriarch, was playing his harmonica with the careful softness of someone trying not to wake a bear or an overtired toddler. The melody wandered around the wagon like a sleepy dog, too tired to chase its tail. It was a tune from the old country, or perhaps something he made up entirely, No one was quite sure, and everyone was too polite to ask. "What's that one called, Pa?" Clara murmured, peeking from beneath the quilt. "It's called Hush. Snow stays longer if you stare," Joseph replied, deadpan. They chuckled, quietly, because laughter used energy, and energy needed beans, which required chewing, which honestly, no one had the strength for anymore. Ma, Eliza Lambert, was knitting by candlelight, her needles clicking together like two insects holding an argument in Morse code. She wasn't making anything in particular, just something warm. History has forgotten most of those nameless winter knitings, the ones without carefully recorded patterns or remarkable dyes, but they were forged from necessity and love, which happens to be the best foundation for something that'll eventually be used as a potholder. Outside, the snow whispered secrets across the prairie. The canvas roof sagged slightly under the weight of it, making every crackle and creak feel like the breath of some ancient mountain ghost settling in to listen alongside them. It was not a scary sound, not tonight. It was the comfort of the world being locked in deep slumber right alongside you. Somewhere across the field, a cow let out a somber moo, as if to say, "Yes, I too am rethinking this life choice." And then there was silence again, except the sounds you never think about. The gentle rap of wind on canvas, a child's sigh, the slow exhale of a sleeping dog beneath the wagon bed, the rhythmic pat-pat-pat as snow thickened its blanket over the world. Far from towns or trains or the ticking rhythm of grand clocks, time inside the wagon had slowed into a loopy sort of dream, the kind where you're never quite sure if you're telling a story or living inside one. And with wool wrapping around dreams and harmonicas giving way to yawns, the Lamperts were not alone. Across the prairie, hundreds of other wagons huddled beneath makeshift roofs and shared the same lullaby of snow and silence. Just as the candle flickered its final glow, settling back into its stub of wax like a theatre audience applauding inwardly, a lazy breeze plucked at the canvas flap. Tomorrow, there would be tracks in the snow worth following, a mystery too cozy to resist. Inside the canvas walls of a covered wagon during a prairie blizzard, time itself didn't so much pass as it curled up for a nap. There were no clocks beyond the dripping of melted snow or the shuffle of boots thawing by a tiny fire. You didn't watch the minutes. You listened to the soft crackle of cold pine and measured the hours by how many spoonfuls of beans it took to forget the wind shrieking outside like a banshee with unfinished business. As night rolled back in, a concept mostly theoretical under cloud-thick skies, a sort of hush fell over the wagon camp. Not a serene, fairy tale hush. More like the muffled silence of 6 people all pretending not to hear each other's stomachs growling in harmony. That's when wagon fever started to hum like a fiddle string tightened too far. To combat this, families employed the only indoor pastime known to survive pre-electricity winters, storytelling, and not the dainty sort. These were sagas told slumped under quilts, passed down from grandparents' grandparents, usually stitched together with a few facts and a generous heap of exaggeration. The sort of tales where an uncle once fought a bear using only a lantern and a very persuasive tone of voice, or when grandma swore she baked biscuits during a blizzard so fierce it chased a pine tree into the latrine. Sometimes the stories were practical survival, lessons in disguise. A father might settle back against the barrel of salted pork and spin the story of the winter of '49, when a boy forgot to keep the axe blade dry and spent the next 3 weeks chasing squirrels with a wooden spoon. Moral: wax your gear and carry extra spoons. Other times, tales veered into the comforting absurd. There was the mysterious tale of the weather goose, a plump, unseen bird that supposedly lived in the clouds and shook her feathers loose when humans got too bold, blanketing the plains in snow as a celestial reminder not to plant tomatoes in February. Laughter, it turned out, was wonderfully thermal. It warmed the lungs, softened the frost of silence, and gave everyone an excuse not to mention how someone's boots were now home to a family of icicles. In between gulps of lukewarm sassafras tea, folks remembered how to be human again. Now, blizzards didn't know about personal space. Snow drifted in through gaps as small as a hymn note, and it liked to settle just where it could create the most chaos. On beds, in firewood baskets, once even in a pot of stew, which mysteriously turned into porridge and was promptly named Snow Chow. The children had a game. They'd name the snow piles forming beside their parents. One was Sir Freeze-a-Lot, another Aunt Dripples, and that particularly plucky formation near the door, Miss Frosterella. Their imaginations whirred like gears on a butter churn, buying time until sleep took over like a warm, heavy quilt. Every so often, during long wagon-bound nights with frost like lace on every beam, someone would pull out whatever passed for a musical instrument. This could be a fiddle, a banjo, or an especially charismatic comb wrapped in wax paper. Even a rusty harmonica that had been in the family since Great-Uncle Silas tried to woo a woman in Missouri failed and found music instead. The tunes were less about melody and more about memory. A simple note could pull forth the image of a spring sun, a cornflower sky, or just a day when nothing froze to the stove. And somewhere amid all of this, snow sighing against canvas, the creak of wooden wheels leased to winter, the sleep-laced verses of a songfolk ballad, you'd hear the quietest sound of all, hope. Hope like a whisper behind a closed window pane, muttering promises of thaw, of green-soaked meadows and creeks you could drink from, of crops, family reunions, real beds with corners, and biscuits that rose with the pride of the hungry. That slightly mad sort of optimism that shows up only when nothing makes logical sense, like planting dreams in soil still hard with frost. And as they drifted off, heads wedged between storage sacks and still warm elbows, the snow outside no longer sounded like emptiness. It was a hush inviting the earth to sleep. Just for now. Tomorrow, after all, would come with its own brand of frozen surprises. As the wind hushed low against the sides of the wagon, quieter now than the snarling gusts from earlier hours, the family inside began to settle into the strange peace that only follows a full day of hard weather. Curtains stitched from old flour sacks flapped lazily in the chill draft, creating a rhythm that, under other circumstances, might almost lull a person to sleep. That is, if your pillow weren't a sack of beans. Snowstorms had an odd way of resetting the rhythm of life on the trail. There was precious little to do, and plenty of time to not do it. The world outside became a whitewashed blur, and the world inside the wagon was reduced to about 7 feet of elbow room and eternal stew. The children, tightly wrapped in quilts that had once wandered all the way from Ohio, curled up beside the iron stove, which ticked and sighed like an old lady muttering to herself. The cast iron box was the indisputable VIP of the wagon's night shift, as long as it didn't run out of wood, or catch the curtains on fire, or inexplicably decide to let smoke backdraft into the wagon and send everyone running out into the blizzard shouting things they very soon regretted. But on this particular evening, it was behaving politely, crackling just enough to offer warmth and the tiniest amount of frontier ambience. Behind the stove, Grandma was slowly shelling beans under a patchwork shawl, not with the urgency of a cook prepping a feast, but with the pace of someone who simply wanted to justify sitting still. Her eyes blinked slowly in time with the flicker of firelight, and every now and again she paused to listen to the wind, as if waiting for it to tell her a secret it had forgotten since Kansas. She'd seen storms, that woman, the sort that could peel the bark off a log or yank the laundry straight off the wash line and into next season. She wore her history like a bonnet, tight around the face, strong against the elements, and mildly disapproving of everything new. Meanwhile, Father was swapping out his damp socks for the slightly less damp backup pair, and muttering something about how he was pretty sure this one's the driest, which had become the official family motto of the past 3 snow days. His boots were arranged by the stove like 2 weary horses that had given up on progress, steam rising from their insoles in gentle whispers of regret. Mother, ever the multitasking marvel of wagon-bound domestic prowess, was using the cookpot not only to simmer a questionable stew of salt pork and boiled flour dumplings, but also to slightly warm up a pair of mittens and dry out a cat. That the family didn't own a cat was beside the point. Out on the trail, if it was furry, moved slowly, and wandered into your wagon during a snowstorm, it became part of the family by default. Wool, in these parts, was less a fabric and more a lifestyle. From the socks that would never dry, to the hats knit too aggressively, to the blankets that weighed more than a small goat, wool was what stood between the settlers and sensory extinction. It also had the unfortunate habit of smelling like a smouldering barn when it got too close to the fire, which, inside a wagon, it always did. The air inside hung heavy with cedar smoke, the faint sourness of stored apples, and the unmistakable bouquet of human togetherness. Cozy, yes, fragrant, debatably. But this is how families weathered the long frozen nights, not just with fire and food, but with the silently acknowledged understanding that survival thrived best in company, that warmth doesn't come only from the stove, but from hearing another's breath in the dark, from hands brushing in a shared blanket, from the scratch of a match lighting against a box for one more cup of tea. They told stories slowly, laced with long pauses, half-remembered endings, and the quiet forgetfulness of snow collecting at the seams of things. No one corrected the details. History isn't a courtroom after all, it's a fireside, and out here it belonged to whoever was warm enough to speak. With bellies lined in lukewarm dumplings and dreams freighted with prairie winds, the wagon's occupants let the hush of the blizzard wrap tighter. Blankets were pulled up, tails of quilts tucked under ears, a boot used as a pillow. A hand found a hand in the dark, and just as the stove gave its last defiant pop, somewhere in the distance, the creak of a frozen axle reminded them all. The cold may be clever, but it wasn't the only one with tricks. We'll soon explore one knotty innovation designed to keep frostbite at bay and boredom from setting the wagon on fire. The prairie night pressed against the canvas of the covered wagon like a hand against frosted glass, silent, persistent, and full of whispers. Through the thick hide lashings and wooden ribs of the wagon's frame, the wind curled like a cat looking for a place to nap, insistent, yet not exactly malevolent, more like mischievous, the kind of wind that enjoys flipping hats, extinguishing lanterns, and telling ghost stories to shivering oxen. Inside the wagon, it was warmer than physics might suggest possible, a feat achieved not with central heating or even a reliable fire, but through the awkward magic of many humans squished together beneath an offensive number of quilts. Layers of wool and patchwork, some thin with age, others dense with mended pride, formed a cozy topography. Somewhere under all that fluff, a child snored like a tiny sawmill. Now, at this hour, deep into the hush of a frontier midnight, the family lay bundled in what historians would best describe as strategic spoon formation. It was a fluent choreography. Toddler wedged sideways like a sash across two older siblings. Mother curled around the baby with the alertness of a nesting cat. Father on the outer edge, both draft shield and reluctant space heater. Blizzard nights required innovation. The homesteaders had no Wi-Fi, no lullabies strummed through smart speakers, no electric blankets spoiled with settings. So they had stories. And butter. Yes, butter. You see, during these long, dark nights, cunning pioneers took advantage of every chance to multitask. And if you're already going to be jolted around by a wagon wheel lodged in a root or a neighbor's midnight sneezing fit, why not brace a tin can between someone's knees and churn a bit of butter while you're at it? It was usually placed between the legs of a heavy sleeper, perhaps Grandpa Orville, whose snores once scared off a pack of confused coyotes. The motion of natural restlessness, combined with the rhythmic bumping of the wagon and occasional family squabble, made for surprisingly efficient butter dynamics. Historians have speculated that a single turbulent night's sleep could produce just enough butter for a celebratory biscuit the next morning, assuming, of course, no one mistook the churn for a chamber pot in the dark. And speaking of chamber pots, let's address the porcelain elephant in the wagon. At night, stepping outside was rarely an option, unless you enjoyed the icy intimacy of your own frozen eyelashes. Instead, families relied on options both practical and deeply unfortunate. Pots, buckets, and, on the rarer, more desperate occasion, a retired coffee tin did the trick in emergencies. These were kept in specific sacred spots, marked either by instinct or, more reliably, a predictable level of shame. One apocryphal tale tells of a pioneer boy named Eli, who, fumbling blindly under layers of quilts, grabbed what he hoped was his coonskin cap and found instead the family's evening bucket. It's safe to say he developed a lifelong aversion to both hats and late-night hydration. But potty misadventures aside, the true genius of wagon living on a blizzard night lay in an uncelebrated piece of pioneer engineering: the hot stone. Before nightfall, the family would heat river stones in the campfire. Once sufficiently toasty, neither volcanic nor lukewarm. They'd be wrapped in wool or burlap and welcomed into the wagon like honored guests. They were placed at the feet, between the backs, or clutched like warm-footed puppies by grateful hands. The hot stones gave just enough comfort to lull even the crankiest child or adult towards sleep. And by morning, they'd be cool again, ready for reheating or tripping over. A cycle of warmth and stubbed toes. As the wind whistled outside, those tucked inside the canvas cocoon would whisper half-remembered lullabies and tall tales. Tales of raccoons who could read, and chickens who foretold weather patterns. Of grandmothers who crossed entire territories with nothing but a walking stick and a pie recipe. Each story was an embroidered patch in the family's ever-growing quilt of memory. Sleep, when it came, was shared, like chores, soup, and second-hand long underwear. But in this shared closeness, in the creaking wood, in the wool-swathed limbs and faint scent of smoked bacon, was something tender, something simpler than safety and just as strong. Outside, snow heaped along the wagon wheels, wrapping the world in silence. Inside, a foot twitched, a baby sighed, and the butter softly sloshed toward a dream. And just when it seemed nothing could stir in that canvas-draped world, a subtle sound emerged from the other end of the camp. The distant crunch of footsteps approaching through snow. As the wind curled tighter around the wagon, like a cat against a hearth. The night outside deepened into its quietest black. Inside, the world was stitched together by whispers, the occasional creak of timber, and the sound of breath fogging up the canvas cover that was, rather optimistically, called home. By now, families had perfected the fine art of sleeping at a diagonal to fit everyone in without someone's foot ending up in someone else's hair, stew pot, or knitting bag. Little hands, pink from the cold, tucked into socks that had long stopped pretending to stay dry. Woolens no longer smelled like sheep, but rather like soot, broth, and the low-voltage tension of people enduring too much weather together. It's a testimony to human adaptability that folk could nap next to a rusting tin of salt pork and still dream of apricots. Now, you might be wondering what folks did to feel merry, or at least marginally less frozen, when pinned down by a snow tantrum in the middle of Kansas. Because there's only so many times you can tell the story of how Uncle Silas once fought off a raccoon with a spoon before you begin to feel, as the Victorians poetically phrased it, a trifle deranged. That's when they got inventive. Wagon games, they called them. Although that term was pretty ambitious for pastimes that included count the knots in the wood and guess who's farted. That last one was less of a game and more of an unavoidable moral dilemma. But other games were frankly charming, in a low-budget sort of way. Families would play button button who's got the button, even when the answer was it's missing, and now Pa's pants won't stay up. Another favourite was shadow stories. With the flicker of their little tallow candle, shadows would skitter across the canvas like playful ghosts. Each child would invent a silly story based on the weird shapes, often involving heroic chickens, haunted boots, or melodrama between mismatched socks, a surprisingly frequent theme, now that I think of it. And what about music? Oh, there was music, definitely. Harmonicas wheezed their tiny blues from deep coat pockets. Someone's fiddle might be produced with reverence and tuned by candlelight, while babies pretended not to cry at the first notes. Ma might tap spoons against her washpan, and if you really wanted to get raucous, someone would hum an old Scottish lullaby slightly off-key until everyone was too emotionally worn down to argue over its accuracy. Even grumpier, wagon folk had hobbies. Rethreading buttons, sharpening needles, mending mittens with leftover yarn ends the colour of past seasons. Because nothing says winter elegance like a mitten that is half sky blue and half vaguely taupe green, maybe from the onion soup dye fiasco. But perhaps the greatest indoor entertainment came from storytelling. Not just reading, though those with a treasured copy of Pilgrim's Progress or Robinson Crusoe would read it aloud until members of the family behaved suspiciously like they were asleep. No, I mean oral storytelling. The dramatic, loosely historical, often wildly inaccurate kind that kids love and adults endure. Stories of ancestors who discovered secret caves filled with pickles. Grandmothers who rode bears to church, side saddle of course. Tales about wolves who just wanted to borrow sugar politely but were terribly misunderstood. These bedtime myths multiplied in the dark corners of those wagons, warmed by imagination and very loose relationships with truth. And there were riddles, rhyme games, and gentle debates, such as, is snow technically a food if you add milk and molasses? Answer, no, but children will eat it anyway. Outside, snow kept falling in patient rhythm, covering ox tracks, forgotten butter churns, and the occasional boot left too close to the flap. The canvas of the wagon roof sagged slightly under the quiet weight of white silence, while inside, the world of 8 feet by 10 feet managed to contain everything essential: warmth, stories, stubbornness, and at least 2 types of cheese wrapped in flannel because the dog wouldn't stop trying to eat it. Though the cold still nipped and sleep was sometimes elusive amid snores and wind moans, there was a strange kind of peace in surviving together, a closeness that lives not just in proximity, but in the shared comedy of hauling your life across a continent in a box on wheels. Sleep came slowly, like an old friend digging through snow to knock, and while the embers in the tin stove whispered their way into ashes, the family curled tighter inside quilts, dreams tugged gently by the rhythm of the wind. Tomorrow, if the snow let up, someone might find Pa's other boot. But first, rest, and the next small legend to tell in the warmth of wagon breath. As the wind howled through the canvas-covered wagons like a homesick ghost with sinus issues, families on the trail found themselves resorting to the ultimate time-honored survival skill of humanity, making do. Not in the modern, Pinterest-perfect, upcycled mason jar kind of way. No, this was the rugged, let's turn a frozen onion and a boot heel into soup variety. By the heart of winter, with snowbanks like knee-high whipped cream and temperatures that turn spit into sleet mid-air, the inside of a covered wagon became less vehicle and more tight-knit snow globe of controlled chaos. Everyone huddled together like mismatched spoons in a drawer wrapped in layers of homespun wool, hand-me-down quilts stitched with love and creative geometry, and the occasional buffalo robe, if the family had traded wisely, or had a daring uncle with a musket, and no sense of self-preservation. With the wooden frame creaking under the weight of snow like an old man settling into a rocking chair, the wagon's interior transformed come nightfall. Chests were shoved to one side, perhaps reluctantly donated by Ma's Hope chest, or a suspiciously empty butter barrel, and the floor was layered with straw, spare clothes, and a hopeful lack of mice. They would light a small lantern, just enough to see Uncle Edgar's mustache twitch in sleep, but not enough to ignite the canvas or melt the icicles forming on the family Bible. Open flames and fabric roofs had a historically strained relationship, so warmth came from shared body heat, piled blankets, and the occasional heated rock from the fire, tucked carefully in a sock, and then another sock, and then, just to be safe, a woolen mitten and a prayer. That's how 19th century families warmed their beds, geology and hope. But neighbors, ever resourceful, also invented clever ways to keep spirits up. After all, nothing shortens a blizzard like stories told in whispers, dad jokes whispered across bunk rolls, and familial snoring syncopated to the rhythm of winter's wind. In some wagons, Pa might pull out a fiddle, if his fingers weren't frozen into chopsticks, and play a sleepy waltz, while the rest of the family drifted off, dreaming of springtime and potatoes not scraped from the icy ground with a hoe and a desperate attitude. And then there was the great guessing game of 1846. Is that the wind or just cousin Jed's digestion? A nightly ritual in many covered wagons. Jed, dear soul, had survived solely on beans and optimism since Fort Laramie, and neither trait was known for its subtlety. Sleep came slowly, but it did come, even with snowflakes sneaking through canvas seams and the occasional eerie coyote yip slicing through the dark like gossip in a small town. Children drifted off imagining that the wind's howl was just the sound of angels practicing the spoons, or perhaps the wagon train itself singing them to sleep. Some families took to tethering their wagons close together during these coldest nights, forming little wagon huddles, a campsite cuddle puddle, if you will. They shared resources, warmth, and the occasional impromptu midnight discussion about whether hoarfrost was a blessing or a misfortune sent by suspiciously judgmental prairie spirits. And speaking of faces, many pioneers during the worst nights wore what were delightfully called comforters, hand-knitted woolen masks that looked like grandma tried to make a balaclava but got distracted by a squirrel. These snug little items covered the head and neck and left just enough of the face exposed to blink politely at someone who might be passing you a hot rock for your toes. Despite the cold and the narrow beds and the omnipresent scent of damp socks and pickled cabbage, there was a quiet kind of warmth inside those wagons. Not the kind you can measure in degrees. No, this was measured in whispers, in stories passed down, in the way children tuck themselves into the crook of a parent's arm, trusting that this strangeness and hardship would pass. Outside, the world was glassed in ice and silence, a white curtain drawn across the stars. But inside, meager though it was, there pulsed the heartbeat of endurance, of laughter, even muffled, of pots clanging and blankets rustling and dreams carrying folk far from the prairie wind. And somewhere in the lullaby of snow and story, another night would fall into sleep. The trail paused, caught in winter's grip, holding breath for morning's thaw. But it would come. It always did. As the wind softened to a whisper and a cow gave a sleepy moo outside, the wagons settled deeper into the hush, waiting, warm and somehow full of hope. And in that hush, something began to stir. Not danger, not frost, but maybe just a hint of something brighter on the other side of night. At last, we find ourselves in the quiet hours of the frontier night, the snow still whispering its ancient secrets against the canvas walls of a covered wagon. Inside, the family has settled into the kind of stillness that only follows long days of labor, laughter, and resilience. The fire outside has dwindled to its last glowing embers, casting wavy silhouettes onto the frost-kissed canvas. Somewhere, an ox sneezes. Probably Bertha. She always did have a theatrical flair. But here, beneath layers of wool, buffalo hides, and questionable-smelling fur pelts, the family curls like kittens in the glow of surviving yet another blizzard night. Heads sharing one pillow, feet migrating uninvited toward the nearest warm belly. If you thought sharing a twin bed with a restless toddler was tight, try cramming 4 siblings, 2 parents, and a conspicuously flatulent dog named Buttons into one 4R10 wagon. Buttons, by the way, had developed a complicated relationship with pickled turnips, which were both plentiful and regrettable in mercantile stockpiles at the time. His gastrointestinal adventures would one day become legend, told across campfires and whispered during family reunions with exaggerated woe. To pass the time and distract from the increasingly pungent air, families often told stories, sometimes recycled from memory, sometimes made up on the spot, sometimes suspiciously similar to whatever the neighbors had said last week. Folklore swirled in the wagon like steam from cornbread batter, filled with talking wolves, haunted rivers, and one recurring bear who seemed awfully good at chess. Games helped too. 20 questions featuring impossibly specific animals, or I Spy, played entirely in the dark. Easier than you'd think when everything inside the wagon is either grey, blanket, other grey blanket, or someone's elbow. Music also made appearances, humble and hopeful. A fiddle if someone had one, and fantastically good luck if that someone also knew how to play it. Otherwise, voices sang the old tunes, hushed and lilting, like echoes from homelands held in memory. The cold, of course, was always there, a guest immune to invitation or insult. Wagons weren't insulated in any modern sense. Canvas, though charmingly rustic, was not especially known for its thermodynamic brilliance, so the pioneers relied on proximity, stubborn optimism, and a belief that frostbite in the middle toe didn't technically count as real frostbite. It was more of a wintry toe nap. At night, parents would often take turns staying semi-awake, listening past the snoring and dog sighs for any sounds of danger. A shifting wind, a howling coyote, perhaps a wayward ember trying to reinvent itself as a canvas-consuming fire. The quiet vigilance of those nights became its own kind of lullaby, woven into the fabric of trust that held these families together. And in spite of, or perhaps because of, the hardships, people laughed, softly, so as not to wake Aunt Clara, who had a notoriously short temper and an even shorter fuse when roused by giggling. But a quiet joke, a shared look, a whispered memory of Uncle Eli freezing his whiskers to the kettle. These were the embers of joy that kept spirits alight far longer than pine logs could manage. Little ones drifted to sleep dreaming of hot biscuits and warm summers, their imaginations richer than any catalogue, their visions dotted with steamboats, friendly trappers, and occasionally a magical talking mule who offered excellent investment advice. Dreams are strange companions in the cold, as outside the stars blinked above the snow-choked prairie, brighter than any city child had ever seen. The wagon remained a small island of humanity adrift in a frozen sea. They didn't have central heating or countertop soup warmers. They had heart and strange family habits. And so the great hush descended once more, as frost formed crystalline lace patterns on the canvas above, and sleep held its gentle dominion. The cold would linger a while longer. But inside the wagon, where parents pulled children close and blankets rose and fell in synchronized snores, there was warmth. Not just from body heat, but from faith, familiarity, and the quiet, powerful magic of simply getting through another night. The dawn would come soon enough, but for now, you're safe, you're warm, and you, like them, have made it through the long, blizzard night. Sleep well, traveler, and may your canvas roof never leak.